Hello my friends, before we start the story, I recommend using your headphones, then relax and live as if you are the hero of the story. I hope you finish the story to the end, and support the video with a like and subscribe to the channel so I can continue providing more news stories. Let's go. I never thought the Amazon would be my prison. I'd heard tales of its wonder, its untamed beauty and endless expanse, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the raw terror and suffocating dread that awaited us there. Before all this madness, I was just a man chasing a dream, the same dream so many of us share, a life free of fear, hunger, and desperation. Back in San Salvador, where I was born, life was a constant struggle. El Salvador is a country where you learn quickly that you can't trust anyone, not even your own shadow. Violence was always one wrong look away, one misplaced word, one street you took too late at night. I wanted out. I needed out. I remember telling my mother, as she lay on her bed staring blankly at the ceiling, her body riddled with sickness we couldn't afford to treat. "I'll make it to the States, Mama. I'll send money back. We'll be okay. You'll see." It felt like a promise. A promise that if I worked hard enough, fought hard enough, I could escape the cycle that had swallowed generations before me. America. Land of dreams. Where if you worked your hands raw, you'd at least be paid for it. The gangs, the corruption, the ever-present threat of death, it would all be behind me. Or so I thought. When I reached Bolivia, I had already crossed borders that felt insurmountable. First to Guatemala, then the vastness of Mexico itself. Each step closer to that invisible line between Mexico and the US felt like climbing a mountain only to find an even steeper peak behind it. But Bolivia was different. I don't even know why I stopped there at first, maybe to catch my breath, maybe because I'd run out of cash. The border crossings had drained everything, my money, my spirit. I remember the streets of La Paz, bustling with people who seemed like they had nothing, yet still had more than me. I found work for a while with a group of construction workers, hauling bricks and mixing cement. It wasn't much, but it was enough to eat, enough to keep moving forward. And it was there, in that chaotic city perched high in the Andes, that I met them. First, there was Rodrigo. He was a Brazilian, short, stocky, and always quick with a joke, even when things got tough. We met at the construction site. He'd left Sao Paulo after his family's small farm was taken by the government for some new project. He couldn't stand the idea of staying in a country where, as he put it, a man couldn't even own the land his family had worked for generations. We hit it off right away. He had the same hunger for a better life that I did. Then there was Carlos, the quiet one. A Honduran like me, but from Tegucigalpa. He didn't talk much about why he left, and I didn't push him. You don't ask questions like that on the road. Everyone's got ghosts, and everyone's running from something. Carlos, though, had this look in his eyes, like he'd seen too much. He was younger than me, but life had aged him in ways that didn't show on his face but in the way he moved, always looking over his shoulder, always ready to bolt at the first sign of trouble. Finally, there was Sofia. Sofia was the wild card. She was from Argentina, from Buenos Aires. She had this fiery energy about her that I couldn't quite figure out. Always talking about politics and how the whole world was rigged against people like us. Sofia had been a law student, passionate about human rights, but when her country's economy collapsed, she saw no future there. She had a sister in New York, she told me, and she was determined to get to her. The four of us clicked in a way that felt like fate. All of us were from different walks of life, from different countries, yet we were chasing the same dream. It was Rodrigo who first suggested the jungle. We'd been sitting in a dingy bar in La Paz after work, each of us nursing a beer, when he leaned in and said, "I've heard there's a shortcut." "A shortcut?" I asked, not really paying attention. "Through the jungle," he said, tapping the table with his finger. "The Amazon. There's a route, a way to bypass the dangerous border crossings. It's hard, but it'll get us to Mexico, straight to the border." I didn't know much about the Amazon then, just the things everyone knows, that it's the largest rainforest in the world, a place filled with mystery and danger. But it didn't sound real to me. It sounded like a fairy tale. A shortcut to the border, through the jungle? It seemed too good to be true. But Rodrigo was adamant. He'd heard stories, rumors passed from one migrant to another. It would be dangerous, but no more dangerous than crossing the desert or dealing with the cartels that patrolled the usual routes into the States. The more he talked, the more it made sense. The jungle might be harsh, but nature wasn't as cruel as men with guns. We all knew the stories of what happened to people trying to cross the northern border. People disappeared. Women were taken. Men were killed for a few pesos in their pockets. Sofia was skeptical at first, but Carlos, he was sold from the start. I think the idea of slipping through the cracks, of taking a route no one knew about, appealed to him in a way that I didn't understand until much later. We spent the next few weeks planning. We pooled what little money we had, stocking up on food, water, and supplies. Rodrigo managed to find a guide, a local Bolivian named Esteban, who claimed to know the jungle like the back of his hand. He was old, grizzled, and looked like he'd spent most of his life out in the wild. He didn't talk much, just grunted and pointed when we asked him questions, but he knew the way, or so we thought. It wasn't until we were deep in the jungle that I realized how much we'd underestimated it. The Amazon wasn't just a forest. It was alive. It breathed, it watched, it hunted. The first few days were exhilarating. We hiked through dense undergrowth, the canopy above us so thick that it blocked out the sun. We followed Esteban as he hacked his way through the vines and trees, always moving forward, always deeper into the green abyss. At night, we'd camp by the rivers, trying to catch fish or boil the water to make it safe to drink. The sounds of the jungle were overwhelming, the constant hum of insects, the distant cries of animals we couldn't see. It was beautiful in a way that was hard to describe, but also terrifying. We were intruders here, and the jungle knew it. The first sign of trouble came on the 5th day. We were crossing a small river when Rodrigo slipped and twisted his ankle. It wasn't bad at first, just a sprain, but it slowed us down. Esteban was getting impatient. He kept telling us we needed to move faster, that we weren't making good time. None of us knew how much further we had to go. Esteban was the only one who had a map, and even then, it was little more than a scrap of paper with lines drawn in pencil. Rodrigo's injury, though, wasn't the worst of it. That night, the rain came. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. The sky opened up, and the water came down in sheets, turning the ground beneath us into a muddy swamp. Our tents were useless. The rain soaked through everything, our clothes, our food, even our spirits. We huddled together, trying to stay warm, but the cold seeped into our bones. By morning, we were exhausted, wet, and miserable. Esteban was gone. He'd taken his machete, his pack, and disappeared into the jungle without a word. I don't know if he'd abandoned us or if something had happened to him, but the result was the same. We were alone, lost in the heart of the Amazon with no guide, no map, and no idea how to get out. At first, we tried to stay calm. We still had supplies, and we figured we could retrace our steps, maybe find a village or a road. But the jungle had other plans. The paths we thought we'd taken were gone, swallowed by the undergrowth. Every direction looked the same, endless trees, vines, and shadows. The rain didn't stop. It poured for days, turning the rivers into raging torrents, and flooding the ground around us. Our food started to spoil, and the little water we could collect from the rain wasn't enough to keep us hydrated. We were trapped. Rodrigo's ankle got worse. The swelling hadn't gone down, and by the second week, he could barely walk. Carlos and I took turns carrying him, but it slowed us down even more. Sofia tried to stay optimistic, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We all felt it, the slow realization that we were in over our heads, that we might not make it out of this place alive. It was on the 10th day that we first heard the sounds. At night, after the rain had let up, there was something else out there, moving through the trees. At first, we thought it was just animals, maybe a jaguar or a pack of wild boars. But the sounds weren't right. They were too deliberate, too human. whispers in the darkness. The crack of branches underfoot, just beyond the reach of our firelight. The days blended into one another after that, a monotonous march of fear and fatigue. I can't say for certain when we first felt the true weight of our isolation in the jungle, but it was sometime after the 10th day, after those strange sounds began haunting our nights. Whatever hope we had of finding our way back was dissolving, and the dense, oppressive green of the Amazon swallowed us whole. Rodrigo's ankle was a disaster. The swelling had grown worse, turning his leg a sickly color that made Sophia panic the first time she pulled back the bandage. He couldn't walk, not without help, and even then, every movement sent a grimace across his face. I kept trying to reassure him, telling him that we'd find a way out, but my words felt empty. I could see it in his eyes. He didn't believe me. And maybe, deep down, I didn't believe me either. Sophia had been the strongest, but even her resolve was cracking. She tried to keep us moving, pushing forward despite the worsening conditions. The rain never really stopped. It would let up here and there, teasing us with a momentary break in the storm, but then it would return with a vengeance, hammering down on us with relentless force. Everything was soaked, and we hadn't been dry in days. Carlos was the one who truly worried me. He had become withdrawn, more so than usual. He barely spoke, barely ate. He'd stare off into the trees, as if expecting someone or something to emerge from the shadows. The weight of the jungle was pressing down on him, and there was nothing I could do to pull him back. I tried once, as we rested near a riverbank, to talk to him about it. "Carlos," I said, sitting beside him as he sharpened a stick with his knife, more for something to do than for any real purpose. "You've been quiet. I know it's tough out here, but we'll get through this." He didn't look at me, didn't even pause his slow, methodical sharpening. "You think this is just about the jungle?" he muttered after a long silence. "We weren't supposed to come here, Nico. This place, it's alive." I didn't understand what he meant at the time, but the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. Carlos wasn't one for superstition, not like Rodrigo, who had muttered prayers under his breath ever since the rain started. But Carlos, the fear in his voice was different. It was deeper, like he had seen something I hadn't. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, though the creeping dread in his tone was contagious. He finally stopped sharpening the stick and turned to look at me, his eyes hollow, as if he hadn't slept in days. "I've heard stories, Nico. When I was a kid in Honduras, there were stories about places like this. The jungle, it takes people. It pulls them in, drives them mad. Makes them disappear. Carlos, we're not going to disappear," I said, though my own confidence was eroding with every passing hour. "We just need to keep moving, keep our heads straight." But he shook his head, his expression darkening. "You hear them at night, don't you? The whispers. That's not animals, Nico. It's something else. Something watching us." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that it was just the stress getting to him. But the truth was, I had heard the whispers too. At first, I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the wind or the rain playing tricks on my mind. But as the days dragged on, those whispers had become harder to ignore. They seemed to follow us, no matter how far we walked. And they were getting closer. We couldn't go on like this. The decision was made when Rodrigo's fever spiked. His injury had gotten infected, despite Sophia's best attempts to clean it. He was delirious, mumbling incoherently about things that made no sense. Talk of shadows moving in the trees, figures watching us from the riverbanks. His condition left us with no choice. We needed to find help, and we needed to find it soon. Sophia took charge that day. "We have to split up," she said firmly, her face pale and gone from exhaustion. "Nico, you and Carlos go ahead. Scout for any signs of a village, a road, anything. I'll stay with Rodrigo and try to keep him stable. We can't move fast with him like this." I didn't like the idea of leaving them behind, not for a second. The thought of Sophia and Rodrigo being alone out here, vulnerable to whatever dangers lurked in the jungle, gnawed at me. But she was right. We couldn't keep dragging Rodrigo through the mud, and if we didn't find help soon, none of us were going to make it out. Carlos was reluctant too, but he agreed. So, after a tearful farewell to Sofia and a feverish, barely conscious Rodrigo, we set off again. I'll never forget the look Sofia gave me as we left, her eyes wide with desperation, but also with something else, fear. It was the same fear I felt. That we were walking into something we couldn't understand. The jungle felt different without them, quieter, if that was even possible. Carlos and I walked in silence for hours, the only sound the wet squelch of mud beneath our boots. My body was numb with exhaustion, every step a battle to stay upright. The constant wetness soaked through my bones, chilling me to the core. But worse than the physical discomfort was the growing sense of unease that had taken root inside me. Carlos hadn't said a word since we left. He marched ahead, eyes darting left and right, his hand always resting on the handle of his knife. I could feel the tension radiating off him, and it made me uneasy. I wanted to talk to break the silence, but the words stuck in my throat. There was something oppressive about the jungle, something that smothered any attempt at conversation. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, we heard it again. The whispers? Low, murmuring voices that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Carlos stopped dead in his tracks, his head snapping toward the direction of the sound. I stopped too, listening, my heart hammering in my chest. "What is that?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. Carlos didn't respond. He just stood there, staring into the thick underbrush, as if he could see something moving between the trees. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but it sounded like they were speaking to us, calling us. "Carlos," I said, my voice barely audible over the growing noise. "We need to keep moving." But Carlos didn't move. He just kept staring into the jungle, his face pale, his eyes wide. I reached out to touch his arm, to snap him out of whatever trance he was in, but as soon as my fingers brushed his skin, he jerked away, whipping his head around to face me. "They're here," he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "They've been following us the whole time." I looked around wildly, searching the trees for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just the endless green of the jungle, the thick, impenetrable foliage that seemed to close in around us. "There's nothing there, Carlos," I said, trying to sound reassuring, though my own fear was creeping up my spine. "It's just—" "No," he interrupted, his voice rising in panic. "You don't understand. They're real, Nico. They're real. The jungle, it's alive. It's watching us." I didn't know what to say. Carlos was unraveling, and fast. I wanted to believe he was just cracking under the pressure, that the isolation and fear were getting to him. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. That there was something out there, something watching us. "Let's just keep moving," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "We'll find a village or a road. We'll find help." But Carlos didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on something in the distance, something I couldn't see. I followed his gaze, squinting into the fading light, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows. Yet the whispers didn't stop. They were louder now, almost deafening, a constant murmur that made it impossible to think. Then, without warning, Carlos bolted. He took off into the jungle, crashing through the undergrowth like a man possessed. "Carlos!" I shouted, running after him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Carlos, stop!" But he didn't stop. He just kept running, faster and faster, deeper into the jungle, the trees closing in around him. I chased him for what felt like hours, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. But I couldn't keep up. He was gone. I stopped, doubled over, gasping for air. The whispers were gone now, replaced by an eerie silence. The jungle felt even more oppressive, more alive, as if it was waiting for something. I was alone. And then I heard it. A scream. Carlos's scream, somewhere far ahead of me, piercing the silence of the jungle. I froze, my blood running cold. Carlos's scream echoed through the jungle, bouncing off the trees and fading into the distance until all that was left was the weighty silence of the forest. My body locked up, a wave of cold terror freezing me in place. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to accept what I'd just heard, that blood-curdling scream that came from somewhere deep in the jungle, the sound of pure fear. "Carlos!" I shouted again, but my voice felt weak in the vastness of the jungle, swallowed almost instantly by the dense canopy above. My mind was racing. Every instinct was telling me to run, to get out of there, to leave the jungle before it claimed me too. But I couldn't just leave Carlos. I'd seen what the jungle was doing to him, breaking him down little by little, but I couldn't abandon him, not after everything we'd been through. We were in this together. I forced my legs to move, pushing through the underbrush in the direction of the scream. The vines seemed thicker here, the ground muddier, as if the jungle itself was trying to slow me down. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest I thought it might burst, but I kept going, calling out Carlos's name again and again, hoping that somehow he could still hear me, that he was still out there. But the silence was oppressive. The jungle felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. The whispers that had haunted us for days were gone, replaced by an emptiness that felt like a vacuum. It was as if the jungle was waiting, holding its breath. For what, I didn't know. I pushed deeper into the green abyss, each step becoming more difficult, my body heavy with exhaustion and fear. I didn't know how long I'd been walking. Time felt meaningless in the jungle. The thick canopy above blotted out the sun, and the constant drizzle of rain made everything blur together. My legs were trembling, my arms scratched and bleeding from pushing through the dense foliage. But I kept going. Suddenly I saw something, a flash of movement out of the corner of my eye. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. At first, I thought it was Carlos, but as I squinted into the shadows, I realized it was something else. Something wrong. There, just at the edge of my vision, I saw a figure. A shape. It was tall, much taller than any human, and it moved with a strange, almost unnatural grace. It disappeared behind a tree before I could get a good look, but I knew what I had seen. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't human. My body was trembling now, fear pulsing through every inch of me. I wanted to run, to turn back and get as far away from that thing as possible, but my feet were rooted to the ground. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The jungle seemed to come alive again, the sounds of insects and distant animal calls returning in a rush, as if they had been paused for just a moment. I gasped for breath, my legs finally giving out beneath me. I collapsed onto the muddy ground, my chest heaving as I tried to process what I had just seen. My mind was screaming at me to get up, to move, to find Carlos. But my body refused to cooperate. For what felt like hours, I just sat there, staring into the trees, waiting for something to come out of the shadows. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen in fear. But eventually, the adrenaline wore off, and I forced myself to stand. My legs were shaky, my head spinning, but I couldn't stay here. I had to find Carlos. I had to find Sofia and Rodrigo. The jungle was a maze, an endless sea of green that stretched on forever in every direction. Every tree looked the same, every path led nowhere. I tried to retrace my steps, but the more I walked, the more lost I felt. The panic started to set in. I could hear my own ragged breathing, my pulse pounding in my ears. The whispers hadn't returned, but now, in the silence, I was beginning to fear what came next. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, a soft rustle of leaves. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. At first, I saw nothing. But then, from behind a nearby tree, Carlos stepped out, his clothes torn, his face pale and gaunt. "Carlos!" I rushed toward him, relief flooding through me. But as I got closer, something about him seemed wrong. His movements were slow, jerky, as if he was struggling to stay upright. "Carlos, are you okay? I've been looking for you." He didn't respond. He just stood there, his eyes vacant, his body trembling. I reached out to touch his arm, but the moment my hand brushed against him, he collapsed. I barely caught him before he hit the ground. Carlos, hey! Come on, talk to me! I pleaded, shaking him gently. His skin was cold and clammy, his breathing shallow. I tried to lift him up, but he was dead weight in my arms. He murmured something, his voice barely a whisper. What? I leaned in closer, trying to catch the words. They are coming, he breathed, his eyes wide with terror. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My eyes darted around the trees, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the suffocating stillness of the jungle. Who's coming? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. But Carlos didn't answer. His body went limp, his head lolling to the side. Carlos? I shook him harder, panic rising in my chest. Carlos! But he was gone. His chest no longer rose and fell with the shallow breaths I had just heard. He was still. Too still. I dropped him, staggering back, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The horror of what had just happened didn't fully sink in until I was standing there, staring down at his lifeless body. Carlos, the one who had always seemed unbreakable, the one who had been so full of life just days ago, was gone. I felt a scream building in my throat, but I swallowed it down, choking on the fear that threatened to consume me. I couldn't fall apart. Not now. I had to get out of here. I had to find Sophia. But I was lost, alone in this nightmare. The jungle didn't care. It had already taken Carlos, and I could feel it closing in around me, waiting for its next victim. I turned and ran. I don't know how long I ran for. The trees blurred past me, the ground uneven and treacherous beneath my feet. Branches whipped at my face, cutting my skin, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. My mind was racing, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I was running from something. Something I couldn't see, but could feel. The jungle was alive with it. A presence, a force that I couldn't explain. It was like the forest itself was hunting me, guiding me deeper into its heart, where there would be no escape. But then, just when I thought my legs would give out, I stumbled into a clearing. At first, I didn't understand what I was seeing. There were large stones, old and weathered, arranged in a circle at the center of the clearing. Vines and moss covered them, but they were unmistakably man-made. Ancient. The air in the clearing was thick, heavy with a strange, almost electric tension. And then I saw her. Sophia was standing in the center of the stone circle, her back to me. Her arms were outstretched, palms facing upward, as if she was offering herself to the sky. Her head was tilted back, her face obscured by her hair. Sophia! I shouted, relief flooding through me as I stumbled toward her. But she didn't move. She didn't acknowledge me. She just stood there, motionless, as if she was in a trance. I reached her, my hands trembling as I grabbed her arm. Sophia, we need to go. Something's out here, it's... She turned to me slowly, and when I saw her face, my blood ran cold. Her eyes were wide, but they weren't focused. They stared through me, past me, as if I wasn't even there. Her lips were moving, but no sound came out. And then I realized she wasn't alone. There were others in the clearing. Shadows. Figures. Moving between the trees, watching us. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The figures were closing in, surrounding us. I could feel their eyes on me, their presence suffocating. And then, in the middle of it all, Sophia whispered, barely audible. They're here. Before I could respond, something moved behind me, something fast, something close. And the jungle came alive. The jungle exploded with movement. Shadows blurred past the edges of my vision, and the whispering returned, louder now, urgent and disjointed, like a chorus of voices just out of reach. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, but my legs felt paralyzed, heavy as stone. I was rooted to the ground, staring at Sophia, whose empty eyes were still locked on something beyond me, something I couldn't see. Sophia, I whispered, my voice trembling. We need to go. Now. She didn't respond. She didn't even blink. Her lips continued to move in that strange, silent prayer, her hands still raised to the sky as though she was communing with something far beyond this world. I could hear the faintest trace of words escaping her, but they were too soft, too indistinct for me to understand. Whatever trance she was in, it had consumed her completely. I turned slowly, the fear swelling in my chest as I faced the trees. The figures were still there, hovering just at the edge of the clearing, their shapes barely discernible against the thick foliage. But they were moving now, slipping between the trunks like ghosts, circling us. I could hear them breathing, hear the rustling of leaves as they advanced, methodical and slow, like predators closing in on their prey. I stumbled backward, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Were these they Carlos had warned about before he died? My heart thudded painfully as the memory of Carlos's scream echoed in my head, his final words haunting me. They're coming. What had we walked into? This wasn't just the jungle. It was something far darker, something ancient. I had heard stories, rumors back in Bolivia and even in Mexico, of lost travelers disappearing without a trace in places like this. Of spirits and ancient forces that dwell deep within the Amazon, unseen by modern man, but very much alive. Suddenly, one of the figures stepped forward. It was tall and impossibly thin, draped in what looked like tattered cloth or leaves, its face obscured in shadow. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as though it was testing the air around it, tasting the fear that radiated from me. My skin prickled as it came closer, its footsteps almost silent despite the thick undergrowth. I reached for Sophia's arm again, my fingers trembling as they closed around her wrist. "Sophia," I pleaded, my voice barely a whisper. "We have to get out of here." But she didn't move. Her skin was ice cold, and as I looked down, I saw something that made my stomach turn. The skin on her wrist was bruising, a deep, purplish black creeping up her arm like a spreading infection. I recoiled, dropping her hand in shock. Her eyes flickered for the briefest moment, as if she was struggling to wake up, but then they glazed over again, and her lips resumed their frantic, soundless murmuring. A sudden rustling behind me snapped me back to attention. More figures emerged from the trees, their shapes vague and flickering, as though they were caught between this world and the next. My breathing quickened, panic overtaking me. I could feel the jungle closing in around us, a suffocating wall of green and shadow. The ground beneath my feet felt unstable, as if it might swallow me whole at any moment. Without thinking, I grabbed Sophia by the shoulders and shook her violently, desperate to snap her out of whatever trance had overtaken her. "Sophia, please! Wake up!" For a split second, her eyes flickered again, and this time, her voice broke through the silence. They're already inside us," she whispered, her voice fragile and cracked. "We let them in." I froze, my hands still gripping her shoulders. Her words sent a chill down my spine, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. The jungle around us seemed to pulse with energy, as if it was alive, breathing, watching us. "We let them in." What did she mean? Before I could ask, a sharp, guttural noise ripped through the air behind me, a sound that wasn't human. My blood turned to ice. Slowly, I turned around, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure that had been approaching us was now mere feet away. In the dim light of the clearing, I could finally make out its face, or rather, the lack of one. It was covered in a mask of twisted vines and bark, its eyes hidden behind hollow, empty sockets. The mask seemed to writhe and twist as it moved, as if it were alive, growing and shrinking with each breath it took. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and nearly falling to the ground. Sophia remained where she was, her eyes fixed on the figure as though she were transfixed by it. The thing turned its head slowly, its empty eyes locking onto me. Then it spoke. The voice that came from behind the mask was low and guttural, a sound like the grinding of stones. It didn't speak in words that I could understand, but the meaning was clear: we didn't belong here. This jungle, this place, it wasn't ours. And we had trespassed. I scrambled to my feet, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body felt heavy, sluggish, as though the jungle itself was pulling me down, rooting me to the spot. The figure took another step forward, raising a twisted hand toward me, its fingers long and thin, like the branches of a dead tree. I was going to die here. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Carlos was gone. Rodrigo was dying. Sofia was lost, taken by whatever this was. And now it was my turn. This jungle was going to swallow me whole, just as it had swallowed everyone else. But then, out of nowhere, a voice cut through the darkness. "Nico! Run!" It was Sofia. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but it was enough to snap me out of my paralysis. She was looking at me now, really looking at me, her eyes wide with fear. Whatever trance she had been in was gone, replaced by the same terror that had consumed the rest of us. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted, crashing through the undergrowth as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel the presence of the figures behind me, hear their whispers growing louder and more insistent. The jungle itself seemed to twist and shift around me, branches reaching out like claws to drag me back. My lungs burned with the effort of running, but I pushed on, driven by pure survival instinct. The trees blurred past me, the ground a treacherous mess of roots and mud beneath my feet. I could hear Sofia behind me, her footsteps pounding through the jungle, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. We ran for what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. Time had lost all meaning in this nightmare. The only thing that mattered was escaping, getting as far away from those things as possible. But no matter how far we ran, the jungle seemed to go on forever, an endless maze with no exit in sight. Suddenly, Sofia screamed, a short, sharp cry of pain. I skidded to a stop, my heart leaping into my throat as I turned to see her crumpled on the ground, clutching her ankle. "Sofia!" I ran back to her, dropping to my knees beside her. Her face was pale, her breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. "What happened?" "I tripped," she gasped, wincing as she tried to move her leg. "I think it's broken." Panic surged through me. We couldn't stop, not now. Those things were still out there, still chasing us. We had to keep moving. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The jungle was quiet again, too quiet. The figures had vanished, but I knew they weren't gone. They were still out there, watching, waiting. "I'll help you up," I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "We just have to." A soft rustle came from the trees ahead of us, and I froze. The figures were back. I could see them now, moving between the trees, their shapes barely visible in the dim light. There were more of them this time, dozens, maybe even hundreds, all of them closing in on us. My hands trembled as I pulled Sofia to her feet, supporting her weight as best I could. "We have to move," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We have to go now." But Sofia shook her head, her face etched with pain and fear. "I can't, Nico. I can't. You have to," I insisted, my heart pounding. "If we don't, they'll catch us." She looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. "Nico, I'm sorry." And then, before I could react, she pushed me away, hard enough to send me stumbling back. I reached out, trying to catch her, but it was too late. She collapsed to the ground, her body limp, her eyes closing. "No! Sofia, no!" I screamed, rushing back to her side, shaking her, begging her to get up. But she didn't move. She was unconscious, her face pale and gaunt, her breathing shallow. The jungle was closing in around us. The figures were almost upon us now, their whispers louder than ever, a cacophony of voices that sent. The figures closed in, their twisted, shrouded shapes moving like shadows through the trees, gliding silently toward us. The air grew thick with the low hum of their whispers, a dissonant chant that vibrated in my skull. My whole body trembled with fear as I crouched next to Sofia, her unconscious form limp and fragile beneath my hands. My mind was screaming at me to run, to leave her behind and save myself, but I couldn't. I couldn't abandon her, not after everything we had been through. But the figures were nearly upon us now, their eyeless faces hidden behind masks of bark and vine, their twisted limbs stretching toward us like claws. The oppressive weight of their presence was suffocating. I could feel their cold breath on the back of my neck, smell the decaying earth that clung to their skin. There was no time. No way out. I looked down at Sophia, my heart pounding in my chest, and knew what I had to do. "Please forgive me," I whispered, my voice cracking as tears welled in my eyes. With shaking hands I stood up, one last glance at Sophia lying helpless on the ground, her chest rising and falling shallowly. I turned to run. My body was sluggish, weighed down by the exhaustion and terror that had settled deep in my bones, but adrenaline kicked in, propelling me forward. I stumbled through the thick underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, roots threatening to trip me at every step. The jungle was alive with the sound of the figures closing in behind me, their whispers growing louder, sharper, as if they were feeding on my fear. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. Not now. I had to get out. I had to find help, even if that meant leaving Sophia behind. But as I ran, something strange began to happen. The jungle around me shifted, the trees bending and twisting, their branches weaving together to form an impenetrable wall of green. No matter which way I turned, the path ahead was blocked, the trees closing in tighter, trapping me in this living labyrinth. It was as if the jungle itself was conspiring against me, pulling me deeper into its heart. The whispers changed too. No longer the voices of the figures, they became clearer, more distinct, human. Familiar. They were speaking in Spanish, in English, in Portuguese, in languages I couldn't recognize but somehow understood. They were calling my name. Nico. Over and over again, like a taunt. The voices of Carlos, Rodrigo, even Sophia, all blending together in a haunting chorus that echoed through the trees. I stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath, spinning around wildly. "Stop!" I screamed. "Please stop!" But the voices didn't stop. They only grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with their relentless chant. My vision blurred, the world spinning around me as the weight of the jungle pressed down on my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, trying to drown out the voices, but it was no use. They were inside me now, crawling under my skin, invading my mind. I could see them in the darkness behind my eyes, twisted faces, hollow eyes, hands reaching out, pulling me down into the earth. I was going to die here. I was going to die in this jungle, and no one would ever find me. Just like Carlos. Just like Sophia. Then, through the chaos, I heard it, a different sound. A low, rhythmic thud, like the beating of a drum. Faint at first, but growing louder, closer. I forced myself to open my eyes, blinking through the haze of fear and exhaustion. And there, just ahead of me, in the shifting, swirling darkness of the jungle, I saw it. A fire. It was small, flickering weakly in the distance, but unmistakable. The glow of flames, dancing in the night, casting long shadows on the trees around it. My heart leapt in my chest. There was someone out there, someone else. I wasn't alone. I pushed myself to my feet, stumbling forward, my legs shaking beneath me. The jungle fought back, the vines and branches tugging at me, but I pushed through, driven by the desperate hope that this fire, this sign of life, could save me. As I neared the fire, the drumbeat grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a drum, it was the steady thumping of a heart, slow and deliberate, like the pulse of the jungle itself. The sound reverberated in my bones, unsettling and alien, but I kept moving toward the light, clinging to it like a lifeline. The clearing appeared suddenly, as if the jungle had parted from me, revealing a space that felt impossibly still, like it was cut off from the rest of the world. The fire burned in the center, its flames low but steady, casting an eerie orange glow on the figures gathered around it. There were 3 of them, seated in a circle around the fire. At first glance, they appeared human, but as I stepped closer, I realized there was something off about them. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed. They wore the same tattered, vine-like cloaks as the figures that had chased me through the forest, their features twisted and elongated in the flickering light of the fire. I stopped at the edge of the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. They hadn't noticed me yet, their attention focused on the fire, the rhythmic beating of the heart drum filling the air. I didn't dare move. My breath was shallow, barely audible over the sound of the flames. One of the figures stood slowly, its movements unnervingly fluid, and began to chant in a language I couldn't understand. The words were guttural, harsh, resonating deep in my bones. The other two joined in, their voices blending into a haunting melody that seemed to make the very air vibrate. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But I was rooted to the spot, my body frozen in place as if the jungle itself was holding me there. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Were they human? Spirits? Had I crossed into some other realm, some ancient world that existed parallel to ours? As I stood there, helpless, watching the strange ritual unfold, something moved in the shadows behind the figures. At first I thought it was one of the ghostly shapes that had pursued me, but this was different. This was solid. Real. It stepped into the light, and my heart nearly stopped. Rodrigo. He looked worse than I had ever seen him, his face pale and sunken, his eyes wide and glassy with fear. His clothes were torn, caked with mud and blood, and he moved with a strange, jerky stiffness, as if every step caused him pain. But he was alive. Somehow, impossibly, he was still alive. Rodrigo! I gasped, stepping forward before I could stop myself. The words slipped out, a reflex, a desperate cry for my friend. The figures around the fire stopped chanting, their heads snapping toward me in unison. Their eyes locked onto mine, cold and empty, like black holes. My stomach turned as a wave of nausea washed over me. I had made a mistake, a terrible mistake. Rodrigo's gaze flickered toward me, recognition sparking for a brief moment before something else took over. His face twisted, contorted into an expression of pure terror, and he took a step backward, shaking his head violently. "Nico, no!" he cried, his voice hoarse and desperate. "Get out of here! Leave!" But I couldn't move. I couldn't leave him, not now. Not when I had finally found him. "What are you talking about?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "Rodrigo, it's me! I came to. They're inside me, Nico!" Rodrigo screamed, clutching his head with both hands. "They're inside all of us!" Before I could respond, one of the figures stepped forward, its eyes never leaving mine. It raised its hand, long, gnarled fingers extending toward me, and I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, a searing heat that spread through my body like wildfire. I gasped, clutching at my chest, my vision blurring. The ground seemed to tilt beneath me, the world spinning as the pain intensified. It was as if something was ripping me apart from the inside, tearing at my very soul. Rodrigo's voice was distant now, barely audible over the roaring in my ears. "Run, Nico! Run before they..." But the words never reached me. The jungle swallowed them, just as it had swallowed everything else. The world was dissolving around me, slipping away as the searing pain in my chest became unbearable. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, clawing at the dirt. I could hear the faint sounds of Rodrigo's voice, his desperate pleas for me to run, but it was like trying to hear through water, muffled and distant. Above me, the figures moved closer. Their eyeless masks loomed over my crumpled body, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. The firelight flickered across their ghostly forms, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched and twisted like the jungle itself. I could feel something inside me breaking, as if a part of my soul was being pulled apart, unraveling at the seams. It wasn't just physical pain anymore, it was deeper, something ancient and primal, a darkness that reached into the core of my being. I wanted to scream, to thrash, but I was trapped in my own body, paralyzed by the force that had taken hold of me. Rodrigo's face flashed in my mind, his sunken eyes, his haunted expression. "They're inside me, Nico. They're inside all of us." Was this what he had meant? Was this the thing that had destroyed Carlos, that had taken Sofia? A force that wormed its way inside, bending your will until you became something else, something less than human? I didn't want to die like this. I couldn't die like this. With a sudden burst of determination, I forced my arms to move, my fingers digging into the dirt. I pulled myself forward, inch by agonizing inch, trying to crawl away from the figures that surrounded me. The pain was overwhelming, my vision swimming in and out of focus, but I couldn't stop. If I stopped, I would be lost forever. The chanting resumed, low and guttural, vibrating through the air. The words were unintelligible, but the meaning was clear. They were claiming me, pulling me deeper into their world, their jungle. And soon I would be one of them. No! I rasped, the word barely escaping my lips. I won't let you! But my voice sounded weak, pathetic, swallowed by the relentless noise of the jungle around me. The drumbeat, the whispers, the rustling of the leaves, they all merged into a cacophony that threatened to drive me mad. Then, through the haze of pain and noise, I heard it, a voice. Faint at first, barely distinguishable from the chaos, but growing stronger. Nico! The voice was familiar, clear, cutting through the fog like a beacon. Nico, get up! My heart lurched. It was Sophia. She was alive. Somehow, through the terror and confusion, I managed to twist my head, searching for her. There, just beyond the circle of the fire, I saw her. She was standing, battered and bruised but very much alive, her eyes wide with determination. She held a long, jagged branch in her hands, brandishing it like a weapon. Get away from him! She screamed, lunging forward toward the figures with a ferocity I had never seen in her before. The figures didn't react immediately. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if they weren't threatened by her at all. But Sophia wasn't deterred. She swung the branch wildly, striking one of the figures square in the chest. The figure staggered back, its mask cracking slightly from the blow, but it didn't fall. It simply turned its hollow eyes toward her, as if it had only just noticed her presence. Nico, get up! Sophia yelled again, her voice hoarse but urgent. I could barely move, my body weighed down by the overwhelming force that still clung to me. But seeing Sophia, seeing her fight for us, reignited something inside me. A spark of life, of defiance. With a tremendous effort, I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, my muscles screaming in protest. The figures were closing in on Sophia now, their long, twisted arms reaching for her. She swung the branch again, knocking one of them back, but they were relentless. There were too many of them. I had to do something. I couldn't let her fight alone. Ignoring the pain that tore through my body, I forced myself to stand, staggering to my feet. My vision blurred, and I swayed on the spot, but I managed to stay upright. The figures hadn't noticed me yet. They were focused on Sophia, drawn to her defiance. I looked around frantically, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a large stone near the edge of the clearing, half buried in the dirt. It wasn't much, but it was something. With what little strength I had left, I lunged for the stone, prying it from the ground with trembling hands. My fingers wrapped around its rough surface, and I hefted it up, the weight nearly pulling me back down. But I didn't let go. Sophia was still fighting, her movements growing more desperate as the figures closed in. One of them reached out, its gnarled fingers brushing her arm, and she screamed, jerking away. That was all I needed. With a surge of adrenaline, I charged toward the nearest figure, raising the stone high above my head. Get away from her! I roared, bringing the stone down with all my strength. It connected with a sickening crack, the figure's mask shattering beneath the force of the blow. The figure let out a low, inhuman groan and crumpled to the ground, its body dissolving into a thick, black smoke that dissipated into the air. For a brief moment, the jungle went silent. The remaining figures stopped, their heads turning toward me in unison, their eyeless faces unreadable. The chanting ceased, the whispers dying down to a faint murmur. It was as if they were waiting. I stood there, panting, the stones still clenched in my hands, my heart racing. The figure I had struck was gone, nothing but a wisp of smoke. But the others were still there, watching. Waiting. Sophia stumbled toward me, her face pale and streaked with dirt and blood. Nico! She gasped, her voice barely audible. We have to get out of here. I nodded, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The adrenaline that had surged through me was fading fast, leaving behind a deep exhaustion that threatened to drag me back to the ground. My vision swam, the world around me tilting dangerously. But we couldn't stop. Not now. Sophia grabbed my arm, her grip surprisingly strong despite her injuries, and together we staggered toward the edge of the clearing. The figures didn't move to stop us. They simply watched as we fled, their hollow eyes following our every step. The jungle seemed to open up before us, the trees parting just enough to let us through. The drumbeat faded, the whispers growing fainter with each step we took, until finally, the oppressive weight that had been suffocating us began to lift. But I knew it wasn't over. The jungle wasn't done with us yet. We crashed through the undergrowth, our movements clumsy and frantic. My mind raced, the events of the last few hours a blur of terror and confusion. What were those things? Spirits? Demons? I didn't know. All I knew was that we had to keep moving. We had to get out. Sophia stumbled again, her ankle twisting beneath her, and I caught her just in time, pulling her back to her feet. We can't stop. I panted, my breath ragged. Not yet. She nodded weakly, leaning on me for support as we continued forward. The jungle was still dense, the trees towering above us, but the atmosphere had changed. It was quieter now, more subdued. The figures weren't following us, at least not visibly, but I could still feel them. Their presence lingered, like a shadow at the edge of my consciousness. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. We both knew that this was only temporary. The jungle wasn't going to let us go that easily. Hours seemed to pass as we stumbled through the thick vegetation, the daylight fading into a murky twilight. My body ached, my head throbbed, and every step felt like a monumental effort. But we kept moving, driven by the faint hope that if we just kept going, we might find a way out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we broke through the trees and into another clearing. But this one was different. It was vast, stretching out before us like an open wound in the heart of the jungle. The ground was barren, the trees on the perimeter twisted and blackened, as if they had been burned from the inside out. At the center of the clearing stood a massive structure, ancient and crumbling, covered in vines and moss. It looked like a temple, long abandoned and forgotten by time. Sophia and I stopped at the edge of the clearing, staring at the structure in awe and fear. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I couldn't. All I knew was that we had been brought here for a reason. This place, this temple, held the answers. But it also held something else. Something darker. The jungle wasn't done with us yet. Sophia and I stood at the edge of the clearing, staring in silence at the ancient temple that loomed before us. The air felt different here, heavier, as if we had crossed some invisible threshold into another world. A world where the rules of nature no longer applied. Where the jungle itself was alive, watching us, waiting. I couldn't tell if it was day or night anymore. The sky above was obscured by a thick, swirling mist that hung over the clearing like a shroud. The temple rose out of the earth like a massive stone sentinel, its crumbling walls covered in dense, tangled vines. There was something almost deliberate about the way it was constructed, as if it had been built to mirror the twisted, chaotic nature of the jungle around it. It was old, impossibly old, but somehow it felt more alive than anything else we had encountered. "We shouldn't be here," Sophia muttered under her breath, her voice trembling. She was leaning heavily on me, her ankle clearly worse off than she'd let on, but I could feel the fear radiating from her, the same fear that was creeping up my spine like a cold, wet hand. "We don't have a choice," I said, though the words tasted hollow. I didn't know why I felt so drawn to the temple, but something inside me knew we had to go in. It was as if the jungle had brought us here, pulled us toward this place through all the terror and confusion. Maybe this was the only way to escape. The ground beneath our feet felt strange as we took our first tentative steps into the clearing, softer, almost spongy, like it had absorbed centuries of decay. Each footstep was a reminder of how alien this place was, how far removed we were from anything resembling safety. I could hear the low hum of the jungle all around us, but it had taken on a different tone now. It was quieter, more subdued, like it was watching us from a distance, waiting for us to make the next move. Sophia's grip on my arm tightened as we approached the temple, her breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. "Nico, this is wrong," she whispered. "We need to go back." "There's nothing to go back to," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. My mind flashed back to the clearing with the fire, to the figures in their masks, and the sickening sound of the stone connecting with the creature's head. The jungle had already claimed Carlos. It had taken Rodrigo, too, in a way I couldn't even begin to understand. And I wasn't sure how much of Sophia was left. This place, whatever it was, it had a hold on all of us. I was terrified. But we couldn't stop now. The steps leading up to the temple were cracked and uneven, the stone worn smooth by time and weather. We climbed slowly, each step feeling like a struggle, the weight of the jungle pressing down on us. The entrance was dark, an open maw that seemed to swallow the light. My heart raced as we crossed the threshold, the cool air inside the temple a stark contrast to the oppressive heat of the jungle. Inside, the walls were covered in strange carvings, symbols and figures I couldn't understand. Some looked human, while others were distorted, monstrous, their faces twisted in agony or ecstasy. It was hard to tell which. The floor was slick with moisture, the stone cool beneath my hands as I ran my fingers over the carvings. There was something deeply unsettling about them, something that made my skin crawl. Sophia stepped beside me, her eyes wide as she took in the bizarre, ancient imagery. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast, echoing space. "I don't know," I said, though part of me was beginning to suspect. This wasn't just a temple. It was a tomb. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the unmistakable smell of something long dead but never fully at rest. We moved deeper into the temple, our footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The light from outside barely penetrated the interior, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe along the walls. Then we heard it. A sound faint at first, like a distant chant carried on the wind. It was similar to the whispers we had heard in the jungle, but this was different, more deliberate, more structured. It was a language I didn't understand, but the cadence of the words sent chills down my spine. "Do you hear that?" Sophia asked, her voice barely more than a breath. I nodded, too afraid to speak. The chanting grew louder as we moved forward, deeper into the belly of the temple. My pulse quickened, my skin prickling with the sensation that we were being watched. The walls seemed to close in around us, the air growing colder, heavier. At the end of the corridor, we came to a massive stone door, half covered in thick vines. The chanting was louder here, coming from somewhere beyond the door, but it was more than just sound. It was a feeling, a pulsing, rhythmic energy that vibrated through the walls and into my bones. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the cold stone surface. "We shouldn't open it," Sophia said, her voice trembling. "We have to," I replied, though my body was screaming at me to turn back. But we couldn't. Not now. With a deep breath, I pushed against the door. It groaned under the weight of centuries, the stone grinding against stone as it slowly opened, revealing what lay beyond. The chamber was enormous, its ceiling lost in darkness, the walls lined with more of the strange carvings. But it wasn't the size or the carvings that made my heart stop. It was what stood in the center of the room. A massive stone altar, draped in vines and covered in symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. And around it, arranged in a perfect circle, were the bodies. Dozens of them. They were skeletal, their flesh long since decayed, but their bones were arranged in a disturbingly deliberate way. Their hands were clasped in front of them, their heads bowed, as if in eternal prayer. And above the altar, suspended in midair by ropes of vine, was something that made my blood run cold. It was a heart. A massive, pulsating heart, much too large to be human. It beat slowly, rhythmically, its surface slick with dark, oozing blood. Each pulse sent a ripple through the air, the same rhythmic thumping we had heard in the clearing, the same sound that had haunted us through the jungle. Sophia gasped, stumbling back in horror. What is that? I don't know, I whispered, my eyes locked on the grotesque sight before me. But I did know. Deep down I knew. This was the source. The heart of the jungle. The thing that had been calling to us, pulling us deeper into its web. And now, we were standing in its lair. The chanting grew louder, filling the chamber, echoing off the walls. The bodies around the altar began to stir, their bones rattling as if coming to life. I felt a surge of panic, my chest tightening, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. We need to leave, Sophia said, her voice shaking. Nico, we need to get out of here. Now. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, my feet rooted to the spot as the reality of what we were facing settled over me like a suffocating fog. The jungle wasn't just alive. It was sentient. And it wanted us. The vines that held the heart in place began to move, slithering down toward the altar like snakes. The bodies around the room began to rise, their skeletal hands reaching out, their empty eye sockets fixed on us. I turned to Sophia, my voice trembling. Run! But it was too late. The vines lashed out, wrapping around my legs, pulling me toward the altar with a strength that was impossible to resist. I screamed, struggling against the pull, but it was no use. The jungle had me now. Sophia grabbed my hand, pulling with all her strength, but the vines were too strong. They tightened around my body, dragging me closer and closer to the heart. Nico! She cried, her voice breaking. I won't let them take you! But even as she said the words, I could feel the jungle's grip tightening, pulling me into its depths. The heart pulsed, its rhythm growing faster, more frantic, as if feeding off my fear. The chanting reached a fever pitch, the walls of the temple vibrating with the force of it. I looked up at Sophia, tears streaming down her face, her grip slipping. And in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about sacrifice. Sophia's hand slipped from mine, and the sensation of losing that connection was like stepping into an abyss. The vines wrapped tighter around my legs, pulling me toward the pulsating heart at the center of the chamber. Each beat seemed to draw me closer, as though it were calling me by name, beckoning me into the dark unknown. The chanting filled the air, overwhelming, pressing in from all sides. The language was foreign, incomprehensible, yet something deep inside me understood. It was a summons, an ancient call that had been echoing through the jungle for centuries, waiting for someone, waiting for us. I could feel the pull in my bones, in my blood, a primal force that was far older and more powerful than anything I could fight. Sophia screamed my name, her voice barely audible over the rising cacophony. Her fingers were still outstretched, reaching for me, but I was too far gone. The vines dragged me closer to the altar, the ground beneath me slick with moisture and decay. My hands clawed at the stone floor, trying to find purchase, but it was no use. The jungle had me now. As I neared the heart, the air grew thick with the smell of rot and damp earth. The vines seemed alive, writhing and pulsing in time with the rhythm of the heart. I could see the blood oozing from its surface, dark and viscous, pooling on the stone altar below. Each beat sent ripples through the air, a slow, methodical thumping that seemed to vibrate through the entire chamber. And then the whispering started again, so soft and insidious that it barely registered at first. But the voices, low, guttural, grew louder with each pulse of the heart, until they filled my mind, drowning out everything else. They weren't speaking in words, not really. It was more like a feeling, an emotion, a sense of inevitability. I was meant to be here. This was my fate. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, a cold, sinking dread that coursed through my veins. I wasn't just being sacrificed to the jungle. I was becoming part of it. The vines tightened their grip, pulling me upright, forcing me to stand before the altar. My chest heaved with the effort to breathe, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel the pulse of the jungle all around me, a living, breathing thing that had ensnared me in its web. The skeletal figures lining the room seemed to sway in time with the rhythm, their hollow eye sockets fixed on me in silent reverence. The heart throbbed above me, beating faster now, almost frantic, as if it was anticipating the final act. The vines around my legs began to rise, creeping up my body, winding their way around my torso and arms, binding me in place. I could feel the cold, slick tendrils pressing into my skin, as though they were seeking a way inside. I wanted to scream, to fight, but my body refused to obey. The jungle had claimed me, and all I could do was stand there, helpless, as the vines tightened their grip. My head lolled to the side, my vision swimming with the overwhelming pressure building inside my skull. I caught a glimpse of Sophia, still standing at the edge of the chamber, her face pale with horror. "Sophia!" I croaked, my voice barely more than a whisper. But even as I called her name, I knew it was too late. I could feel the jungle pulling me deeper, consuming me, piece by piece. Then, just as the vines began to constrict around my throat, something shifted. The chanting faltered, the rhythm of the heart slowing, as though the jungle itself had paused for a brief, fleeting moment. I blinked, trying to focus, my mind sluggish and heavy. The vines loosened, ever so slightly, and I felt a faint warmth spreading through my body, a small spark of life amid the crushing weight of the jungle's presence. And then I saw her. A figure, shrouded in shadow, standing at the far end of the chamber. She was tall, her features indistinct in the dim light, but there was something unmistakably human about her. Her eyes glinted with a strange, otherworldly light, and she moved with a grace that seemed at odds with the ancient, decaying temple around us. The moment her gaze met mine, the air in the chamber seemed to shift. The vines that had been holding me in place recoiled, as though they had been burned by her presence. The heart's rhythm stuttered, its once steady pulse growing erratic, almost panicked. The woman stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. The chanting ceased completely, the silence that followed almost deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and frantic in the stillness, but the jungle was quiet. The woman's eyes never left mine as she approached the altar, her expression unreadable. There was something ancient about her, something that felt older than the jungle itself. And yet she didn't seem like the jungle's servant. She seemed, apart from it, above it. She stopped just before the altar, her eyes flicking briefly to the heart that hung above us. Her lips parted, and she whispered something, a word or a name, I couldn't be sure. But whatever it was, the effect was immediate. The heart gave a shudder, its massive bulk convulsing violently. The vines that had been holding it aloft quivered, their grip faltering, and for the first time, I saw something resembling fear in the way they moved. Sophia staggered forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. Who is that?" I shook my head, unable to answer. The woman's presence filled the chamber, her very being seeming to command the jungle itself. She raised a hand, her fingers outstretched, and for a moment, I thought she was reaching for me. But instead, her gaze shifted to the heart. She spoke again, her voice low but powerful, and the heart let out a sound, a deep, mournful groan that reverberated through the walls. The vines snapped, one by one, and the heart began to fall. I watched in stunned silence as the heart crashed onto the stone altar, sending a spray of dark, congealed blood across the room. The vines writhed in agony, retreating into the shadows, and the skeletal figures around the chamber collapsed into heaps of bones, their long vigil finally over. The jungle let out a long, low sigh, as though it had been holding its breath for centuries. For a moment, all was still. Then, slowly, the woman turned to face us. Her eyes, glowing with that strange, ethereal light, locked onto mine, and I felt a surge of something, recognition, maybe, or understanding. It was as if she had seen everything I had been through, everything I had fought for, and she knew. Without a word, she gestured toward the entrance of the temple. The message was clear. It was time to leave. I turned to Sophia, my legs trembling beneath me. "We have to go," I whispered, though the words felt surreal, as if they didn't belong to me. Sophia nodded, her face pale, her hands shaking. Together, we moved toward the exit, the oppressive weight of the jungle lifting with each step we took. The heart was gone. The vines had retreated. And the jungle, for the first time, was silent. But as we crossed the threshold of the temple, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't free. Not yet. The jungle might have let us go, but something was still watching. As we stepped outside the temple, the oppressive heat of the jungle hit us like a wall. The air was thick, humid and dense, but after the suffocating grip of the temple, it almost felt like freedom. Almost. The strange mist that had settled over the clearing still clung to the ground, swirling lazily around our feet, as if it were deciding whether to pull us back or let us go. I kept expecting the vines to lash out from the earth and drag us back into the heart of the temple, but nothing happened. Sophia was trembling beside me, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She limped as she moved, still struggling with her injured ankle, but I could tell something far worse had broken inside her. The look in her eyes was distant, haunted, as if part of her was still trapped in that chamber with the bodies and the beating heart. I understood that feeling all too well. The jungle hadn't just taken our friends. It had taken something from both of us, something we would never get back. We were quiet as we made our way back into the jungle. The sky above had darkened, the mist thickening as it wound through the trees, and though the sun had to be somewhere behind the dense canopy, the light had faded into a dull, gray haze. The air was still, unnaturally so, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath, waiting for our next move. I didn't know where we were going anymore. My sense of direction, my internal compass, had been shattered the moment we entered the temple. Everything around us looked the same tangled vines, the same towering trees, the same endless stretch of undergrowth. It felt like we were walking in circles, like the jungle was folding in on itself, trapping us in an infinite loop. Sophia stumbled beside me, her exhaustion clear in every step. I caught her arm before she could fall, but she barely acknowledged me. Her skin was pale, clammy, and she hadn't said a word since we'd left the temple. I wanted to tell her it was over, that we'd made it through the worst of it, but I knew that was a lie. The temple might have let us go, but the jungle was still alive. Still watching. After what felt like hours of trudging through the undergrowth, we stopped near a massive tree with twisted roots that seemed to claw out of the ground like the fingers of some ancient beast. I lowered Sophia to the ground, propping her up against the trunk, and knelt beside her. "You need to rest," I said, though my own voice sounded hollow in the heavy air. "Just for a little while. We'll keep going soon." Sophia didn't respond. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused, staring at some distant point in the trees. I could feel the weight of the jungle pressing down on us, the same weight I had felt in the temple, and I wondered if maybe we hadn't really left at all. Maybe the jungle had never let us go. I sat down beside her, leaning back against the tree, trying to catch my breath. My entire body ached, my muscles screaming in protest with every movement, but it was the exhaustion in my mind that felt the worst. The weight of everything that had happened, the deaths, the fear, the jungle's pull, it was crushing. I had no idea how we were going to make it out of this alive. The jungle was quiet around us, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind of silence that hummed with tension, a low, almost imperceptible buzz that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I could feel the eyes of the jungle on us, hidden in the shadows, lurking just out of sight. The mist moved slowly through the trees, curling around the roots and vines like a living thing, and every now and then, I thought I saw something move within it, a shape, a figure, something that disappeared the moment I tried to focus on it. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me after everything we'd been through. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just paranoia. The jungle had shown us too much for me to dismiss its power now. It wasn't done with us yet. A rustling sound broke the silence, and my body tensed immediately. I glanced around, scanning the trees, my heart racing in my chest. The sound came again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't coming from the jungle. It was coming from Sophia. I turned to her, panic rising in my throat as I saw her body convulsing slightly. Her eyes were wide, but they weren't seeing me. They were locked on something else, something far away. Her lips moved, but no words came out, just a soft, breathless whisper. "Sophia!" I grabbed her shoulders, shaking her gently. "Sophia, snap out of it!" But she didn't. Her breathing grew shallow, and her skin seemed to grow paler by the second. Her body trembled uncontrollably, and I could feel her pulse racing beneath my fingers, too fast, too erratic. "No, no, no," I muttered, my voice shaking. I didn't know what to do. I had no idea what was happening to her. She had been fine, or as fine as any of us could be after what we'd been through. But now it was like something had taken hold of her, something I couldn't see. I pulled her closer, holding her against my chest, trying to steady her. Her body was so cold. Too cold. I kept whispering her name, begging her to stay with me, but her eyes remained locked on that distant point, unfocused, lost. Then, through the silence of the jungle, I heard it again, the chanting. It was faint, just on the edge of hearing, but it was unmistakable. The same rhythmic, haunting chant that had filled the temple. The same chant that had lured us deeper into the jungle's grip. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The sound was coming from all around us, the jungle itself humming with that ancient, terrible energy. I looked around frantically, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. Just trees and mist and the endless, suffocating weight of the jungle. "Sophia, please," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Please come back." But she didn't. She was slipping away from me, her body growing colder, her breaths more shallow. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the jungle closing in on us, tightening its grip with every passing second. And then I saw them. Figures moving through the mist. Shadowy, indistinct, but undeniably there. They moved slowly, deliberately, their shapes shifting and warping as they approached. I couldn't make out their faces, if they even had faces, but I knew they were watching us. I could feel their eyes on me, on Sophia, and I knew what they wanted. They were the same figures I had seen before, in the clearing with the fire. The same ones that had performed the ritual, that had offered the sacrifice. They were part of the jungle, part of its will. And they were coming for us. I scrambled to my feet, pulling Sophia up with me, though she could barely stand. She was barely conscious, her body limp and unresponsive in my arms. I had to get her out of here. I had to keep moving. But there was nowhere to go. The jungle surrounded us, the mist thickening, the figures drawing closer. I dragged her forward, my heart pounding in my chest. My legs were shaking, every step an agonizing effort, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The chanting was deafening now, the figures so close I could almost feel them brushing past me in the mist. The jungle was alive, and it was hungry. I could feel its pull, the same pull I had felt in the temple. The same force that had tried to take me. It was stronger now, more insistent, as if the jungle knew it was about to claim its prize. The figures in the mist moved with purpose, their chanting rising in pitch, building to a crescendo. I stumbled, nearly falling, as I dragged Sophia through the undergrowth. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches twisting and reaching out like claws. I could feel the jungle pulling us deeper, pulling us back toward the heart, and I knew, in that moment, that we were never meant to escape. The jungle didn't let anyone go. Not really. Sophia's weight grew heavier in my arms, her body growing colder by the second. I was losing her. The jungle was taking her. I screamed her name, my voice raw, but it was lost in the sound of the chanting, the relentless, inescapable hum of the jungle's will. And then, through the mist I saw it. A light. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. It flickered through the trees, a small, fragile flame in the darkness. It shouldn't have been there, nothing human could survive in this place, but it was. The light flickered in the distance, faint but undeniable. It felt impossible, surreal even, like a hallucination conjured by my exhausted mind. After all the horrors the jungle had shown us, how could there be hope in a place like this? But the moment I saw it, something deep inside me stirred, a desperate, instinctual drive to survive. I tightened my grip on Sophia, her body limp and cold in my arms. Her breathing was shallow, and her skin had taken on an ashen hue, as if the life was slowly draining out of her. The jungle was relentless, pulling her deeper into its grip. I could still hear the chanting, that low, guttural hum that reverberated through the trees, but my focus was fixed on the light. It had to be real. It had to be. "Come on, Sophia," I whispered hoarsely, more to myself than to her. "Just hold on a little longer." With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced my legs to move, dragging us both toward the light. The mist swirled around our feet, growing thicker as we stumbled through the undergrowth, and the figures in the shadows still lingered, watching, waiting. I could feel them closing in, their presence like a dark cloud pressing down on us. The jungle itself seemed to resist our every step, the ground soft and treacherous beneath us, as if it were trying to swallow us whole. The light grew brighter, closer, but it flickered erratically, as if it could vanish at any moment. I couldn't lose it, not now. I focused on that small flame, that fragile thread of hope, and kept moving, my breath ragged and my muscles screaming in protest. Sophia was barely conscious, her head lolling against my chest, her body growing colder with every step. I could feel the life slipping away from her, the jungle pulling her deeper into its grasp. The figures in the mist seemed to sense it too. Their movements became more frantic, their chanting louder, more frenzied. They were coming for her, for both of us. But I refused to let go. As we stumbled forward, the mist began to thin, and the trees opened up, revealing a small clearing bathed in the soft glow of the flickering light. It was like stepping into another world. The air here was still thick with humidity, but there was something different about it, something less oppressive, as if the jungle's grip had loosened, if only slightly. At the center of the clearing was a makeshift fire, its flames dancing weakly in the damp air. And beside it, sitting cross-legged on the ground, was a figure, a man, his face obscured by the shadows, but undeniably human. He was hunched over, his back to us, stirring something in a small pot over the fire. For a moment, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. After all the terror, after everything the jungle had thrown at us, there was a person here. A real, living person. "Help!" I called out, my voice barely more than a rasp. "Please help us!" The man didn't move at first, as if he hadn't heard me. But then, slowly, he turned his head, his eyes glinting in the firelight. He looked older, his face weathered and lined, his hair long and matted. There was something unsettling in his gaze, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, but I didn't care. We needed help, and he was the only chance we had. He rose to his feet, moving slowly, deliberately, and as he did, I saw that he was holding a crude walking stick, its surface covered in strange carvings. He took a step toward us, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, I wondered if I had made a mistake. If this man was just another part of the jungle's nightmare. But then he spoke, his voice rough and low. "You're not supposed to be here." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning I didn't understand. I swallowed, my throat dry and raw. "We're lost," I managed to say. "My friend, she's hurt. Please help us." The man's eyes shifted to Sophia, and for the first time, something like concern flickered across his weathered face. He approached us slowly, his gaze locked on her, as if he were assessing the situation. He knelt beside her, his movements careful and deliberate, and pressed 2 fingers to her neck, feeling for a pulse. For a long, agonizing moment, he said nothing. Then he exhaled sharply and looked up at me, his eyes narrowing. "She's fading," he said quietly. "The jungle, it's taking her." His words sent a jolt of fear through me. "You have to help her," I pleaded. "You have to save her." The man frowned, his gaze drifting back to Sophia. "The jungle doesn't let go easily," he muttered, almost to himself. "But there might be a way." He rose to his feet, turning back toward the fire. "Bring her closer," he instructed, his tone leaving no room for argument. With a surge of adrenaline, I dragged Sophia's unresponsive body toward the fire, laying her down as gently as I could. The man crouched beside her again, muttering under his breath as he rummaged through a small satchel at his side. He pulled out a handful of dried herbs, crumbling them between his fingers, and sprinkled them over the flames. The fire flared briefly, releasing a pungent, earthy scent into the air. The man knelt beside Sophia, his hands moving with practiced precision as he placed the herbs on her chest and forehead. His lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear, and the air around us seemed to hum with energy. I watched in silence, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know who this man was, or how he knew what to do, but he seemed to have some connection to the jungle, something deeper than I could understand. And right now, that was all that mattered. The chanting from the jungle had grown faint, distant, but I could still feel the presence of the figures in the mist. They were waiting, watching, their influence lingering in the air around us. I could feel the jungle's pull, the same primal force that had tried to claim us from the start, but now it felt different. The jungle was still there, still powerful, but the man's presence seemed to hold it at bay, if only for a moment. As he worked, Sophia's breathing slowed, her body growing still, but something had changed. Her skin wasn't as cold, and the ashen pallor that had overtaken her face seemed to fade slightly. She wasn't out of danger, not yet, but there was a flicker of hope, something I hadn't felt in a long time. The man continued his ritual in silence, his hands moving with a careful, deliberate rhythm. He seemed to be drawing energy from the jungle itself, channeling it into Sophia's frail body, and with each movement, the fire burned a little brighter. But the jungle wasn't finished with us. I could feel it stirring in the shadows, the tension in the air growing thicker with each passing second. The figures in the mist hadn't left. They were still there, waiting for their moment. "Is she going to make it?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man didn't look up, his focus still on Sophia. "If the jungle lets her go," he said, his tone grim. "But you, both of you, have trespassed into something you don't understand." "What do you mean?" I demanded, frustration and fear boiling over. "We didn't want any of this. We just wanted to survive." The man's eyes finally met mine, and there was something dark in them, something that made me feel like I'd missed a crucial piece of the puzzle. "The jungle doesn't care what you want," he said quietly. "It has its own rules, its own will. And you've crossed the line. You've seen things that no one was meant to see." His words hung in the air, heavy with a truth I couldn't deny. The jungle had shown us its secrets, and now it was claiming its due. We had been caught in something far older and more powerful than we could ever comprehend. The man returned his attention to Sophia, his hands moving faster now, his voice rising in a soft, rhythmic chant. The flames flickered higher, casting long shadows across the clearing, and I could feel the weight of the jungle pressing down on us once more. We were running out of time. The jungle was coming for us, and this fragile moment of hope was slipping away. The flames of the fire grew higher, their light flickering and casting eerie shadows on the trees surrounding the clearing. The man's chant continued, his voice a steady, rhythmic murmur that seemed to blend with the pulse of the jungle itself. The air around us felt charged, alive with an energy that was both invigorating and terrifying. I kept my eyes on Sophia, watching as her breathing, though still shallow, began to take on a more regular pattern. The color in her cheeks slowly returned, but the change was slow, fragile. The man's ritual was our last chance, the only hope we had left. I glanced over my shoulder frequently, scanning the edges of the clearing. The mist still swirled around us, thickening with every passing minute, and the figures in the mist remained just out of sight. Their presence was a constant, oppressive force, a reminder of how close we still were to the edge of the jungle's grasp. The man's face was set in concentration, his movements precise and deliberate. He was drawing on something ancient, something powerful, and it was clear that he was using all of his skill and knowledge to counteract the jungle's influence. His eyes, though focused on Sophia, held a depth of understanding and fear that suggested he knew far more about the jungle's dark heart than he was willing to share. "Why are you helping us?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The question had been burning in my mind since we'd first seen him. If the jungle had its own rules, its own will, why was he intervening? The man didn't look up from his work. "Not everyone who wanders into the jungle is a fool," he said quietly. "Some of us remember what it was like before the darkness took hold. We remember the old ways, the old magic. And we fight to keep it alive." The jungle, the figures in the mist, and the man's cryptic words formed a tangled web of mystery and fear. I didn't fully understand what he meant, but there was a hint of something deeper in his words, a recognition of the jungle's power and the struggle against it. I could feel the tension in the air, the jungle pressing in around us with a palpable sense of urgency. The chanting grew louder, more intense, and the figures in the mist seemed to shift, their movements becoming more erratic. It was as if they were restless, agitated by the man's presence and the ritual he was performing. Sophia's breathing continued to improve, but she was still unconscious, her body fragile and pale. The man's ritual seemed to be working, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a temporary reprieve. The jungle was relentless, and its influence was still strong. The mist around us thickened, and I could feel the jungle's gaze on us, a relentless, unblinking presence. The figures in the mist seemed to grow closer, their shapes becoming more distinct, more menacing. Their movements were slow, deliberate, and they seemed to be closing in on the clearing, drawn by the ritual and the hope that it represented. "Is there anything else we can do?" I asked, my voice tinged with desperation. "Is there any way to stop them?" The man's eyes flickered up, meeting mine with a look of solemn understanding. "The jungle has its own balance," he said softly. "It will not be easily swayed. But there are ways to fight it, ways to push back. You must be prepared for what comes next." The air grew colder, and the mist swirled more violently around the clearing. The chanting from the jungle grew louder, more frenzied, and I could feel the pressure building, the jungle's influence tightening its grip. The figures in the mist were nearly upon us now, their shapes shifting and warping in the dim light. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself as the man's ritual reached its climax. The flames of the fire roared higher, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. The man's chanting grew more urgent, his hands moving faster, and I could feel the power of the ritual building, pushing back against the jungle's pull. The figures in the mist began to wail, their voices a haunting, mournful sound that echoed through the trees. The jungle seemed to convulse, its presence becoming more chaotic, more desperate. It was as if the very fabric of the jungle was being stretched and pulled, fighting against the force that the man was wielding. Sophia's body stirred slightly, her breathing growing steadier, and I could see the faintest hint of color returning to her cheeks. But the figures in the mist were relentless, their wails growing louder, more insistent. The jungle was fighting back, its will still strong, its influence still present. The man's ritual reached its peak, and the fire blazed with an intense, blinding light. The jungle seemed to recoil, the mist swirling violently, and the figures in the mist were momentarily obscured by the light. It was a moment of tenuous hope, but it felt like a fragile shield against the overwhelming power of the jungle. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the light began to fade. The fire's flames grew lower, and the mist began to thicken once more. The figures in the mist emerged from the shadows, their shapes now clearly visible, their faces twisted in expressions of malevolent glee. The man's chant slowed, his energy visibly drained, and he fell to his knees beside Sophia, his face pale and strained. "It's not enough," he gasped. "The jungle is too strong. You need to be ready." I looked around the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest. The jungle's presence was overwhelming, its will still relentless. We had gained a small reprieve, but the danger was far from over. The figures in the mist closed in on us, their movements deliberate and slow, their eyes fixed on Sophia. The jungle was reclaiming its hold, and the moment of hope we had experienced was slipping away. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. We had to find a way to fight back, to escape the jungle's grasp. The man had given us a chance, but now it was up to us to take it. With a final, desperate look at Sophia, I resolved to face whatever came next. The jungle was far from done with us, but we couldn't give in. We had to keep fighting, no matter how dark the path ahead. The figures in the mist were almost upon us now, their shapes growing clearer, their intentions more ominous. The jungle's grip was tightening, but I refused to give up. As the man's ritual faltered, I braced myself for the next challenge, knowing that our survival depended on more than just hope. It depended on our will to fight against the darkness that surrounded us. The jungle was closing in, and the struggle for survival was far from over. The jungle closed in around us, the mist swirling like a living entity, and the figures in the mist loomed closer, their shapes growing more distinct and threatening. The clearing, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a fragile sanctuary surrounded by an encroaching darkness. The man's ritual had given us a brief respite, but it was clear that it wasn't enough. The jungle's power was relentless, its will a force that refused to be easily overcome. I glanced at Sophia, her condition still precarious despite the temporary improvement. Her breathing was steadier now, but her body remained frail, her color still pale. The man's energy was clearly spent, his face drawn and tired, but he managed to meet my gaze with a look of grim determination. "You must understand," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The jungle will not relent. It has its own way of balancing the scales, and it will not let you go without a fight." His words felt like a dark prophecy, and the weight of them settled heavily on my shoulders. The jungle was alive, and it had its own rules, its own sense of justice. We had trespassed into its domain, seen its darkest secrets, and now it was demanding its due. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing thoughts. The figures in the mist were almost upon us, their shapes becoming clearer. They moved with an unsettling grace, their eyes fixed on us with an intent that sent shivers down my spine. The chanting from the jungle had grown more rhythmic, a relentless pulse that seemed to synchronize with the beat of my own heart. "What can we do?" I asked, desperation edging my voice. "How can we fight this?" The man shook his head, his expression one of resignation. "The jungle is a powerful force," he said. "Its will is not easily swayed. You must find a way to appease it, to offer something in return." I glanced around the clearing, trying to make sense of his words. The fire still burned, its flames flickering weakly, but it was clear that the ritual had only been a temporary measure. The jungle's presence was growing stronger, its influence more insistent. The figures in the mist were almost upon us, their faces now clearly visible, their expressions twisted in malevolent anticipation. "What do we have to offer?" I asked, my voice trembling. "We have nothing." The man's eyes shifted to Sophia, and he sighed deeply. "Sometimes it is not what you offer, but how you offer it," he said softly. "You must make a choice. You must find a way to appease the jungle's will, or it will take what it wants." The figures in the mist closed in, their presence now a palpable force that seemed to press in on us from all sides. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the jungle's pull growing stronger, a relentless force that sought to reclaim what it had lost. I looked at Sophia, my heart aching at the sight of her frail body. She had come so far, endured so much, and now she was on the brink of losing everything. I couldn't let that happen. We had to find a way to fight back, to escape the jungle's grasp. The man's words echoed in my mind, and I realized that we had to do more than just resist. We had to understand the jungle's will, its demands, and find a way to offer something that would satisfy it. But what could we possibly give? In the midst of the mounting pressure, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The jungle was a living entity, a force that demanded respect and understanding. If we were to survive, we had to find a way to appease it, to offer something that would balance the scales. "Do you have any idea what it wants?" I asked the man, my voice urgent. "Is there something we can give?" The man looked at me with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "The jungle demands respect," he said. "It demands acknowledgement of its power, its place in the world. You must offer something that shows you understand its nature, that you are willing to honor it." I nodded, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of his words. The jungle had shown us its power, its darkness, but it had also shown us a glimpse of its ancient magic. If we were to survive, we had to acknowledge that power, to offer something in return. As the figures in the mist drew closer, their eyes gleaming with a dark intent, I took a deep breath and stepped forward. The fire flickered weakly, its light casting long shadows across the clearing, and I felt a surge of determination. We had come this far, and I wasn't about to give up now. I reached into my backpack, pulling out the small, precious items we had carried with us, things we had collected on our journey, tokens of our lives before the jungle. I laid them out beside the fire, arranging them with care. It wasn't much, but it was a symbol of our journey, our struggle, and our respect for the jungle's power. The figures in the mist paused, their movements slowing as they watched. The chanting grew softer, less insistent, and I could feel the pressure in the air beginning to ease. The jungle's presence was still strong, but there was a shift, a change in its rhythm. I turned to the man, my heart pounding in my chest. "Is this enough?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Have we offered enough?" The man looked at the offerings with a thoughtful expression. "It is a start," he said. "But the jungle is not easily appeased. You must continue to show respect, to acknowledge its power, or it will not be satisfied." The figures in the mist began to retreat, their shapes fading into the shadows as the jungle's grip loosened. The chanting grew quieter, and the oppressive weight in the air began to lift. The moment of respite was fragile, but it was a chance to survive, to escape the jungle's grasp. I glanced at Sophia, her breathing still steady, and felt a flicker of hope. The man's ritual, our offerings, and our determination had given us a moment of reprieve, but we had to be ready for whatever came next. The jungle was still a powerful force, and its demands were far from over. As the figures in the mist faded into the darkness, I knew that our struggle was not yet finished. We had bought ourselves some time, but the jungle was still a relentless, unpredictable force. We had to find a way to escape, to survive, and to honor the power that had claimed so much from us. The man's eyes met mine one last time, and there was a glimmer of understanding in his gaze. "You must be prepared," he said softly. "The jungle will test you until the end. Stay strong, and do not forget the lessons you have learned." With those words, he turned away, disappearing into the mist as if he had never been there at all. The fire burned low, its light flickering as the jungle's presence began to recede. The figures in the mist were gone, but the jungle's grip was still strong, a reminder of the darkness that lay beyond the clearing. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. The jungle was still out there, its power still a looming threat, but we had a chance. We had to use it wisely, to fight back against the darkness and find a way to survive. As I looked at Sophia, her breathing steady and her color slowly returning, I knew that the final challenge was yet to come. The jungle's will was relentless, and we had to be prepared for whatever it would throw at us next. With a sense of determination, I resolved to face the final test, to fight for our survival, and to honor the power of the jungle in whatever way we could. The end was near, and we had to be ready for the final confrontation. The jungle was waiting, and the struggle was far from over. The jungle was eerily quiet, the oppressive atmosphere of the mist having lifted, leaving behind a palpable tension that was almost worse than the chaos. The figures in the mist were gone, and the jungle's grip felt momentarily loosened. But the respite was fleeting. The jungle's power was ever present, a silent, unyielding force that we couldn't ignore. I glanced at Sophia, who was now stirring slightly, her breathing more regular. Despite the faint smile that tugged at the corners of her lips, her condition remained fragile. I knew we couldn't stay here much longer. The jungle had given us a chance, but it wouldn't be long before it reclaimed its hold. I surveyed the clearing, the fire burning low, its light barely enough to cast dim shadows on the surrounding trees. The jungle seemed to be holding its breath, as if waiting for the next move. The man's ritual had bought us time, but the jungle's hunger was far from satiated. We needed to act quickly. As I prepared to move, I heard a rustling in the trees behind us. I tensed, my heart racing. The jungle was shifting, its presence reasserting itself. I could almost feel the eyes of the jungle upon us, watching, waiting for our next move. I carefully lifted Sophia, trying not to disturb her fragile state. The effort was draining, but I had to get us out of this clearing before it was too late. My mind raced with thoughts of escape routes and possible paths, but the jungle was a labyrinth, and every direction seemed equally treacherous. With a final look at the dying embers of the fire, I turned and began to move, stepping cautiously into the dense undergrowth. The mist seemed to envelop us again, thick and suffocating, but the jungle's oppressive presence was slightly less intense. I tried to follow the faintest traces of a path, hoping against hope that it might lead us out. The jungle, however, was a living maze, shifting and changing with each step. The trees seemed to close in, the undergrowth thickening, and the air grew warmer and heavier with every passing moment. Every direction seemed to lead us deeper into its grasp, and I could feel the weight of our situation pressing down on me. The sound of distant drumming reached my ears, a rhythmic, droning beat that seemed to echo through the jungle. It was a haunting reminder of the jungle's ancient power, a signal that its influence was still strong, still present. I tried to push it from my mind, focusing instead on the immediate task of finding a way out. Sophia's breathing was steady but shallow, and I could feel the weight of her body growing heavier. The jungle's oppressive heat was taking its toll on us both. I needed to find a way out, and fast. The paths we took were increasingly convoluted, each turn seeming to take us further into the jungle's depths. Suddenly, a familiar figure appeared ahead, one of the figures we had seen in the mist. My heart skipped a beat, fear gripping me as I recognized the shape. But this figure was different. It was more solid, more defined, and it was blocking our path. I tensed, preparing for a confrontation, but as the figure stepped forward, I realized it was not the malevolent presence we had encountered before. It was a local guide, someone who seemed to be familiar with the jungle and its dangers. His appearance was unexpected, a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness. "Help us!" I called out, my voice strained and desperate. "We need to get out of here!" The guide's eyes met mine, and there was a flicker of recognition in his gaze. Without a word, he stepped aside, gesturing for us to follow. His presence was a stark contrast to the ominous figures we had seen, and I felt a glimmer of hope. We moved quickly, the guide leading us through a series of narrow, winding paths. The jungle seemed to relent slightly, the oppressive atmosphere easing as we followed him. His movements were confident and sure, as if he knew the jungle's secrets intimately. As we walked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and gratitude for this unexpected savior. The guide moved with a practiced ease, navigating the jungle with a skill that seemed almost supernatural. The paths he chose were clear, and the jungle's oppressive presence seemed to recede as we followed him. The guide led us through dense undergrowth and overgrown trails, his path a careful dance between danger and safety. The drumming sound had faded, and the jungle's atmosphere felt less heavy, though its power was still palpable. Eventually, the dense jungle began to thin, and we emerged into a small clearing. The guide stopped and turned to face us, his expression serious but not unkind. "You've been through a lot," he said. "The jungle is a powerful force, but it can be navigated if you know its ways." I looked around, the sense of relief almost overwhelming. We were no longer surrounded by the thick mist and the ominous figures. The clearing was a safe haven, a brief respite from the jungle's relentless grasp. "Thank you," I said, my voice filled with gratitude. "We couldn't have made it without you." The guide nodded, a small smile on his lips. "The jungle is not easily conquered, but it respects those who understand it. You've seen its power, and you've learned its lessons. Now you must find your way out." He gestured to a narrow path leading away from the clearing, a trail that seemed to offer a way out of the jungle's clutches. "Follow this path," he said. "It will lead you to safety. But remember, the jungle never forgets. It will always be watching." With that, the guide turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving us with a final, hopeful path to follow. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of our journey lift slightly. We had come so far, endured so much, and now we had a chance to escape the jungle's relentless grasp. I glanced at Sophia, her breathing steady but still fragile. With renewed determination, I began to follow the path, moving as quickly as I could. The jungle's presence was still felt, a haunting reminder of the trials we had faced, but now there was hope. As we made our way along the path, I couldn't help but reflect on the lessons we had learned. The jungle was a powerful force, a living entity with its own rules and demands. It had tested us, pushed us to our limits, and shown us its darkest secrets. But in the end, we had survived. We had faced the jungle's trials, fought against its darkness, and found a way out. The path ahead was uncertain, but we had hope. We had survived the jungle's test, and now we could finally see the possibility of escape. The journey was far from over, but the jungle's grip had loosened, and the path to safety was clear. As I looked ahead, I felt a sense of resolve. We had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. The jungle had claimed its due, but we had survived its trials. With a final glance at the dense, oppressive jungle that we were leaving behind, I took Sophia's hand and led her along the path. We had made it through the jungle's ordeal, and now we were ready to face whatever lay beyond. The jungle had tested us, but it had not broken us. We were survivors, and we had the strength to face the future. After days of grueling travel along the narrow path provided by the guide, we finally emerged from the oppressive embrace of the jungle and into a more open terrain. The transition was almost surreal. One moment we were ensnared in the jungle's suffocating grip, and the next, we were stepping onto a road that felt like the threshold to a new chapter in our lives. The road was dusty and winding, but it was a symbol of hope, a tangible sign that we were nearing the end of our arduous journey. The scenery shifted from dense foliage to sprawling fields, and the air was clearer, carrying the promise of freedom. We continued along the road, driven by the relentless pursuit of our dreams and the knowledge that the end of this chapter was just within reach. Days turned into weeks as we traveled across various states, navigating the complexities of border crossings and legalities. Each milestone was a victory, a reminder of how far we had come. Eventually, we reached a bustling city where the opportunities we had dreamed of were within our grasp. The city was a far cry from the jungle's darkness. Skyscrapers stretched towards the sky, the streets were alive with the energy of countless people, and the promise of a new beginning was tangible in the air. It was a place where dreams could take shape, where hope and hard work could transform into something real. Each of us took our first steps towards building a new life. I found work in a small but promising tech startup. The skills I had honed during our journey, the resilience and problem-solving abilities developed in the jungle, translated into valuable assets in this new environment. I was able to contribute meaningfully to my team, and over time, I found stability and satisfaction in my work. Sophia, after a period of recovery and adjustment, found a job at a community organization, dedicating her time to helping other migrants navigate their new lives in the city. Her experience in the jungle gave her a unique perspective, and her compassion and dedication quickly made her a valued member of the team. She found a sense of purpose and fulfillment in her work, channeling her experiences into helping others. David, with his knowledge of construction and his unwavering determination, found a job with a reputable construction company. His skills and strong work ethic were soon recognized, and he began to build a successful career, contributing to the development of new projects across the city. Aisha, with her background in business, started working for a nonprofit focused on entrepreneurship and economic development. Her innovative ideas and keen business sense helped the organization expand its reach, and she found success in her role, contributing to the growth and support of local businesses. Years passed, and our lives slowly but steadily improved. The city became our home, a place where we could thrive and pursue our dreams. We built lives for ourselves, establishing careers, finding stability, and creating a sense of belonging. Despite the demands of our new lives, we remained close friends, bound by the shared experience of our journey through the jungle and the challenges we had overcome. We celebrated each other's successes, supported each other through difficult times, and maintained a deep, enduring connection that spanned the years. Our friendship became a testament to our resilience and the power of shared dreams. We would often reminisce about our journey, reflecting on the trials we faced and the lessons we learned. Our experiences had forged a bond that was unbreakable, and we knew that no matter where life took us, we would always be there for each other. As time went on, Each of us continued to pursue our dreams with the same determination that had carried us through the jungle. We achieved personal and professional milestones, built families, and embraced the opportunities that life in America offered. Yet, the memory of our journey remained a guiding force, a reminder of the strength and perseverance that had brought us to where we were. The jungle, with all its trials and tribulations, was now a distant memory. It had shaped us, tested us, and ultimately strengthened us. The dream of reaching America had been realized, and with it came the fulfillment of our aspirations and the promise of a better future. Our story was one of courage, resilience, and the unbreakable bond of friendship. We had faced the darkness of the jungle and emerged into the light of new possibilities. We had found our way to a place where dreams could be realized, where lives could be rebuilt, and where we could thrive. And as we looked back on our journey, we knew that the bonds we had forged and the dreams we had achieved were the true triumphs of our adventure. The jungle had been a harsh teacher, but it had also been the catalyst for our transformation, leading us to a place where hope and dreams could finally flourish. With hearts full of gratitude and hope, we continued to embrace our new lives, cherishing the friendships that had seen us through our darkest days and celebrating the achievements that had come from our unwavering determination. The journey was over, but the legacy of our struggle and success lived on in every step we took toward our future. Thank you for listening.